Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, Developing a Cybersecurity Program. I'm Matt Flora. I'm a Senior Account Executive at Compass Cybersecurity, and I'm here with Bob Olson, our CEO.
Good afternoon, everybody.
So today on the agenda, we're going to talk about the challenges specific to independent schools relating to securing your sensitive information. Then we're going to go into the three key components of a cybersecurity program and really how to incorporate your security into your overall risk management strategy. And then finally, we're going to end on cybersecurity as a service, which is just a way to really do that incorporation of security into your everyday risk management strategy. So briefly, I want to talk about how you guys can participate today. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the control panel. So if you want to hide that, there's that orange button on the left-hand side of that control panel that you can go ahead and click, and it'll minimize that panel. You're also able to dial in through your computer or through your phone if you'd like. So you just go ahead and choose one of those options and dial in if you choose to do so on your phone. At any time, if you have any questions, there is a questions panel in that control panel. So if you go ahead and send that in, I'm going to be monitoring that while Bob's giving the presentation, so we can stop whenever we get some questions in and Bob can answer those for you. And if we don't get to your questions today, we'll be able to reach out to you within the next day to answer that one-on-one. And then finally, we are going to be recording today's webinar. So if there's something that you missed or you wanted to send to a colleague, we will send that out to you later this week so you're able to share that. So with that, I'm going to pass the torch over to Bob to get started.
Thanks, Matt, and good afternoon, everybody, once again. So as we go through these four different areas, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the tools that Matt just described so that it can be interactive as much as possible. There'll also be an opportunity at the end for Q&A, as you probably would expect, but please feel free to ask questions as we kind of go through the material. So with that, why don't we go ahead and jump right in? So independent schools have some of the, schools in general and independent schools in particular have some unique, challenges that are outside of the norm for most, private industry organizations or governmental organizations. So just kind of walking through these, most of these are probably near and dear to your hearts. You really have in our opinion, or my opinion, one of the biggest challenges is balancing that protection of data, whether it's, sensitive confidential data that your organization might hold relative to, financial tax records from a financial aid perspective, or maybe student medical records, or just sensitive information from a strategic perspective, so maybe your capital raise plans or strategic plans. It's really trying to balance protecting all that data while at the same time fostering an open learning environment. So your mission is to educate students, and technology is obviously a huge part of that. So how do you balance protecting that data in a way that ensures you're doing what you need to be doing, but in the same sense not having that become an impediment to the learning environment? You also, independent schools, from our experience, have what I consider a really dynamic user community. And what I mean by that is you've got a wide range of students from an expertise perspective, wide range of faculty also from an expertise, and sort of what the lower school versus an upper school teacher probably has quite different IT needs, technology needs. And then you also have parents and maybe guests. So if you have or potentially guest students. And so those are all users of your network infrastructure potentially that all have different requirements and have a different need to access different things. And you also need to really, sort of segment them off or protect them or protect the data from some of those users differently, depending on which kind of class that they fall in. Another challenge is it's really, cybersecurity is very similar to sort of saying you're in the medical field. It's a very wide-ranging field of expertise with a lot of individual specialized expertise that sort of falls into that, and so it's really a challenge. Most of the schools that we deal with are fairly light and lean from an IT perspective. Everything from schools where they don't have any in-house IT expertise, it's all outsourced, to, I think the largest one that we've worked with has somewhere in the neighborhood of like 10 or 11 maybe IT personnel, but most of the schools have anywhere from 2 to 4, and those are individuals that are also doing help desk and those types of things. So you're expecting those individuals to really have a fairly wide range and fairly deep understanding of a fairly complicated subject. And there's also a lot of tools that are out there today that, even some of the freeware that's no longer free. And so what you wind up having to do is you've got a fairly small number of IT resources that are also trying to manage or integrate multiple different cybersecurity service offerings from, in most cases, multiple vendors. So that's a significant challenge. And then, as I touched on already, most organizations have a fairly limited, budget as well as technical resources, whether it's in-house or outsourced. And most outsourced IT vendors don't necessarily have expertise when it comes to security. So those are just some at a high level. I'm sure there's some unique challenges that you're facing from a cybersecurity perspective, but those were kind of the biggies. So now we'll jump into the next portion of the discussion, which really talks about what we consider, 3 of the key players or 3 areas to address in a cybersecurity program. So we call these the 3 pillars of cybersecurity: people, policies and procedures, and technology. And they're really, for all intents and purposes, really in this sort of order of importance as well. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So the people side, so really every member of your organization, whether it's a guard at the front desk, receptionist, all the way up to the head of school, everybody has a role. Students, faculty, parents in some situations, everybody has a role. And unfortunately, humans are truly the weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. And so what we find is, a wide range of expertise and awareness for just basic, security kind of 101 practices. And what happens is the hackers sort of prey upon those individuals that are, sort of lacking or maybe not as aware as they should be. In the absence of that awareness, if you don't have strong policies and procedures that really kind of, identify clearly, articulate clearly your organization-specific rules and guidelines, then you're leaving your user community, students, faculty, admin, parents, to really kind of guess based on a set of information that they may not have from a best practices perspective. And then the third pillar is technology. And really, technology should be an enabler and an enforcement mechanism for the policies and procedures as well as for the people side. All too often we see that technology has been implemented and it's sort of the other way around. It's kind of the dog, the tail wagging the dog. Really, the ideal situation is where the technology that you've chosen or choose, if you're implementing something new, should support the organization's policies and really provide what we call a defense in depth, which may be a concept you're familiar with. So it's a layered approach to defense. So there's no one thing, there's no one tool that you can go buy that will protect all of your data. There's some vendors out there that are sort of, kind of trying to give that impression, but the reality is that, that tool does not exist, whether it's a hardware tool or a software tool. And so there's several things: network segmentation, kind of dividing your network up, firewalls, access control, antivirus. There's a lot of things that can and should be done. Most of the times when we do assessments, we very rarely find organizations where we are recommending that they go buy some additional piece of technology. And that's because most organizations, schools in particular, we find have done a reasonably good job of investing in their technology. And so, but it hasn't necessarily been optimized correctly or configured correctly from a securities perspective. So I'll dive into some of these a little bit more. We always like to look at cybersecurity from a risk management approach, because really, at the end of the day, and I'll touch on that later, cybersecurity is really just another set of threats. And so I'll walk into a little bit deeper dive on each of those 3 pillars or those three three key players, and things that you can be doing to really, from a risk management perspective, actionable things. So like I mentioned, people are without a doubt the weakest link, so it's critically important that you address those. Address all of the different users within your community. And there's a variety of ways that you can, or strategies and approaches that you can take. Clearly training, which is, very near and dear to your hearts because it's a learning organization. Training is super important on just basic, kind of security 101 best practices. So social media, safe browsing, password management, some of those are very common. It could be telecommuting, could be, using public Wi-Fi, those types of things. We always recommend a variety of sort of delivery mechanisms, which it probably resonates with you. So everybody learns different. Adults are no different than children in that everybody learns differently. And so, you can use any of these or a combination of these, or we have clients that use all of these. Seminars, webinars, similar to just as this, record the webinars, let them play it back later at their leisure. Podcasts are a rapidly growing area. E-newsletters, again, what resonates with one person may not resonate with another, and so you want to try a variety of different sort of approaches. Mock phishing exercises, so if you're not, these are the emails that everybody unfortunately receives on a probably regular basis, and they're essentially trying to get you to click a link or open a file or do something to then allow a hacker to gain access. And so one of the things that makes it very personal, which is I think one of the best techniques when it comes to risk management from an organizational perspective, is doing regular mock phishing exercises. And so it's not meant to be a punitive exercise, it's really meant to be a learning opportunity, as well as a prioritization. So if there's individuals in your organization that, as you go through this exercise, that, either initial offenders or kind of repeat offenders, those are the folks that you probably want to focus your, sort of retraining or provide them some additional awareness. And then another thing that's important to do is to get a kind of handle on your organization and how they fare, is to do security awareness surveys. And those really aid in focusing and prioritizing that training. So if your organization does extremely well, if you have well-documented policies from a social media perspective, and your organization does really well there on the awareness survey, then that's probably not an area that's worth spending any real time from a training perspective. Maybe you periodically touch on it if there's some new application or something else that changes, but your time would be better spent, and resources focusing on areas where you're weaker. From a policy perspective, so these policies, like I mentioned earlier, really establish the rules of the organization, and absent these rules, folks are allowed to sort of guess, and typically they choose kind of the path of least resistance, which is often the easy way out and probably not in line necessarily with what you would like them to be deciding to do. And it's not just IT-related policies that we're talking about. So it could be, one area that we find, particularly in the academic world, that is generally fairly weak, is the employee out-processing side. So most people have done a good job of investing in the process from an employee onboarding perspective and, welcoming them into your organization. But when it comes to someone leaving, which, people come and go regularly, it's not as solid a process as it should be. And so you wind up with, accounts being left open or people still having access for some period of time that they shouldn't have. We also, within the policy kind of pillar, we put into that also what we call data inventory and classification. And so if you don't know what your data is, where it is, how it should be protected, it's really hard to protect it correctly. So you may be, in some cases, overly securing, maybe the school calendar or some, generally available information may be locked down more tightly than it needs to be. But then there may be other sensitive information that isn't being secured as much. So if you don't really know what data you have and where it is, it's really hard to make sure that you're protecting it correctly. And then on the policy side, technology can and really should be used to enforce the policies. So a lot of the times what we see is when the technology hasn't been configured correctly, it's because there's a lack of policies. And And so basically what they've decided to do is to just sort of take the default settings out of the box. And then once they do invest in developing new policies, they may or may not have had the time or even been aware that they should go back and maximize the technology that they have to really enforce that policy across the organization. Technical, I'm not going to dive into these, each of these in great detail, but the point here is, again, and this really very squarely fits into the whole defense in-depth sort of mindset and approach as you're, laying out a risk management plan or strategy for cybersecurity and data protection. These are all things that independently, no one of these things is kind of the be-all, end-all from a technical cybersecurity perspective, but collectively, these are all very critical things that sort of the core basics that you should be doing as an organization on a in some cases regular basis. Patch management is probably one of the most important things on here, and it's one of the areas that we find most organizations are either completely lacking a process or it's a very ad hoc process. And so again, I'm not going to walk through each one of these, but these kind of collectively are some of the key things that you should be doing or your organization should be doing from a technical perspective.
Real quickly before we continue to the next section, we have a couple questions here, so I figured now would be a good point to stop. So this first one is more policy related. It says, when your data is in the cloud, are policies like these needed?
It's a good question. Yes, policies are definitely needed, even if you use the cloud. A lot of the independent schools or just schools in general, whether it's K through 12 or higher ed, are either currently using a lot of cloud applications, cloud service provider, arrangements, or they're very much in the midst of moving towards that. And in some ways, it's even more important than if you're if you're keeping it in house, because for a variety of reasons. One, you want to make sure you clearly think through all of the different sort of security and policy related components when you're moving something to the cloud. Just because you're moving it to the cloud doesn't absolve you of still being responsible for the data in the eyes of the law. And so if you have well-written policies, then they need to be or should be updated to include whatever requirements or expectations that you have of your cloud service provider, and maybe they even become part of your contract. Or if it changes, policies and procedures are living documents, so it may be that you want to update them to take into consideration now that you no longer maybe have your email platform hosted in-house, maybe it's hosted outside, and that then changes or causes you to change your documentation.
Cool, thanks. Two more here. This one is, what would you say is the largest security threat to schools?
Probably the largest security threat to schools, which is probably true for just about any organization right now based on what we're seeing, is ransomware, which you may or may not be familiar with. So ransomware is basically, it typically is delivered to an organization through some type of phishing attack, and then that phishing attack, email attack, is really trying to get you to either, a user to go to a website where a piece of malware or malicious software is downloaded, or maybe it already has the attachment included. And, essentially what it does is it locks up your data, and then, holds it hostage and, asks you to pay a ransom. That's the name. That's probably the one that's of the greatest risk, I would say, to schools, but really any organizations in general. The FBI, who keeps close tabs on that. I was actually at a conference with the head of the DC Cyber Division a few weeks ago, and he said that they've already seen, just for the first 6 months of this year compared to last year, or compared to all of last year, that they've seen over a 300% increase in ransomware. And it's now costing organizations several $1 billion in annual fees, if you will. So that's probably the number one. And then there's some other close seconds, but that's probably the top one.
Cool. And last one, do outsourced IT vendors often perform vulnerability scans?
It really depends. So that's a little bit of the wild west when it comes to outsourced cloud providers or even IT vendors. It really depends. Some of the larger ones are doing that, and they would be, should be happy to show you evidence that they're doing it. What we see is a lot of the mid-tier, there's literally hundreds of cloud providers that are out there, which most people don't realize. And oftentimes why clients go with them is purely from a pricing standpoint. And so you really want to make sure that they are doing the basics, just like you're expecting your organization to do the basics when it comes to security. You want your vendors to do the same thing, if not even, hold them to a higher standard. If that's their main line of business, then they should be taking security even more seriously than and more rigorously than your organization.
Awesome. All right, well, that's all I had, so we can go ahead and move on.
So taking a little bit of a step back and really looking at it from, kind of an enterprise risk management perspective, at the end of the day, cybersecurity, I talk to executives, private industry, government, nonprofit, academic on a very regular basis. And it's surprising to me sometimes how they don't necessarily sort of think of cybersecurity from a, what I consider kind of traditional risk management perspective. So at the end of the day, risk management is all about dealing with potential threats. And really, cybersecurity is just a new set of threats. So it's probably significantly more complicated than potentially a natural disaster or some type of, fire or something like that, because, a cybersecurity incident or data breach has the ability to, spread literally within minutes, if not seconds, within an organization, and it could, literally paralyze the entire organization, regardless of where they are geographically, if their network's, connected. But I think it's still important to sort of look at it from that risk management perspective. And there's four, classic risk management approaches or strategies, mitigation strategies that really apply. So sharing, it used to be called transferring, some people still call it that. I mean, really what that is insurance. At the end of the day, if you talk to your insurance broker or carrier, I'm pretty sure that they will not share the same sentiment that you have transferred the risk to them and that they've accepted that. It's definitely a shared risk approach with most insurance companies that I've ever dealt with. You can accept the risk, probably not super relevant when it comes to cybersecurity. There is a degree of acceptance somewhat from a prioritization standpoint. So, you do an assessment and you identify the top 10 risks. Maybe a risk 11 or 12 isn't as likely to happen, and so you're willing to accept that, but you understand sort of the implications potentially. Avoid, probably not. As we move further and further into technology becoming more and more a part of our lives, probably pretty unlikely that you could avoid it. Where you can avoid things is if you choose to not use certain applications or maybe embrace certain architectures. That's sort of kind of in the avoidance camp. Most of what we're talking about today in particular, and really what most organizations are kind of doing from an approach standpoint, is focused on reducing the risk. So what are the it's that defense in depth approach. What are the layered steps that I can take to really try and minimize the likelihood of an incident, or if we do have an incident, really minimize the impact to the organization and try and sort of isolate it as quickly, identify it, isolate it, and remediate it as quickly as possible. And it's key to understand, not every organization has the same set of risks that they're, should be worried about from a cybersecurity standpoint. So an example would be, maybe your organization does a lot of e-commerce transactions through your website, and that's, maybe all of your, school store, bookstore, all that stuff is managed through some type of online store. Clearly, that if that store, if that website that was the interface for your clients or your students, whoever the users are, purchasers are, if that site was not available, because of any number of attacks for some period of time, that clearly would be not a good thing. Versus if you're a school that you don't your website's fairly static, you still wouldn't like the fact that it wasn't available, but it wouldn't be as impactful potentially. And so you really kind of have to walk through those scenarios and look at your own organization. Not every school is the same, and they could be different because of the types of students that they serve. It could be different because of the geographical area they're in, the network infrastructure they've chosen to implement. Some heads of school, associate heads of school, trustees have a very different perspective on risk management. Some are really worried. Some are worried, but not nearly as much as others. And ideally, it's hard to make decisions without information. And so from a risk management perspective, you really want to perform a risk assessment and use that to then develop your cybersecurity program roadmap and priorities. Again, this is all about context and prioritization and maximizing the use of your resources. So if you're just sort of investing in security without having ever done an assessment, odds are that you're probably not necessarily addressing those those areas where you kind of get the biggest bang for your buck. So some other strategies, you really want to understand your organization's weaknesses, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Both weaknesses as well as potential sort of attack vectors, meaning how could hackers come in. So if you have a lot of if you use a lot of third-party cloud providers or vendors, then that could be some area that they could exploit. So you want to kind of go through that mental exercise of identifying your organization's weaknesses. Like I mentioned earlier, context and prioritization are super critical. Making sure that you are making intelligent decisions from a risk management perspective relative to cybersecurity. So again, you don't want to go invest in upgrading or updating some piece of equipment if there's really nothing. There's no critical data or critical, if it's not playing an important role in your overarching mission. That money probably could be, or time, or whatever it is, could be better spent somewhere else. You really want to know what, who, and where about your data. So what data do you even have? Who is responsible for maintaining it, kind of ownership of it, and where is it kept? Most organizations are pretty surprised after they go through kind of a data inventory exercise to really find out how widespread the data is in the organization and where it is. It's always in a lot more places than most organizations would ever guess. You want to take an enterprise-wide program approach, so it's not confined to just the IT department. Everybody always thinks of them as sort of being the owners of cybersecurity. They have a very significant role, but at the end of the day, there's lots of other organizations that should be equally as involved. Risk management, finance, HR, executive team, those types of things. Like I mentioned earlier, you want to take a multifaceted approach that covers all three of those pillars we already talked about. There's lots of frameworks that are out there. I get asked all the time, like, what framework's the best? I don't know that any of them are the best. Some of them are industry specific. One in particular that's fairly generic in the sense that it's applicable to any organization across any industry is called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Some of you may have heard of it. NIST CSF, it kind of goes by. That is a very specific. It's not a standard or a regulation. It's really a framework, but it's probably the framework that, in my opinion, is the most practical and applicable to organizations. Again, regardless of the industry. So last thing we'll cover is just some things to think about how you can put together, kind of a cybersecurity program. We've sort of bucketed a set of services under what we call CSaaS, or cybersecurity as a service. So we'll just kind of walk through those quickly. I'll share with you what they are and kind of the value, what value they add to you or would add to your organization. So the goal of cyber, so it's basically a suite of services that address all three pillars, so people, policy, and technology, and it really has two main objectives. It's to provide a single comprehensive service offering that addresses, what we view as sort of the core critical security components. There's lots of other things that you could be doing that organizations choose to do, but these are sort of the core components that we believe in. And it's also to provide an affordable solution that is really practical for small to mid-sized organizations. Most of the time, especially in the academic world, budgets are relatively tight, and so it's unlikely that schools would be able to afford nor be interested in going and trying to sort of build their own sort of security program or roadmap, which would include, 4, 5, 6, maybe more different security vendors or security partners. And so, again, the goal of this is really to provide an affordable solution that takes all those pieces and puts them into a single service offering. So here is just a summary. I'll walk through each of these. There's a slide, and just kind of the frequency, you can kind of get a sense. So again, the thought behind security, developing a security program and security as a service is to getting in this sort of regular cadence, this regular rhythm, just like you do with your annual, financial audits. Most organizations are now thinking of security on an annual, kind of a rolling 12-month program perspective. And so here's an example of how you can kind of layer things, layer different core components to have a fairly comprehensive security solution. So with that, we'll just jump right into the specifics. So the first one is what we call a cybersecurity health check. It could start with a full assessment. This is so the analogy I use is, maybe you switch to a new doctor or a new medical practice, and typically when you do that, they would want you to come in and do a full assessment, and that's usually a more comprehensive set of tests and analysis and assessments. And then ideally, when you go back, 12 months later for your annual physical or an annual health check, it's a much less intense, much less kind of rigorous test. And so it's a similar concept here. So this is essentially, or what we call a security essentials audit that looks again across all three areas, so technology, people, and policy. And it's really meant to be a way for you to show, kind of in an annual snapshot where your organization's security posture is. Are there any suggested remediations that need to take place across any of those three areas? It's also a way to communicate with senior leadership as well as, if you have a risk committee, you can show progress. So here, here's our score in year 1. Here's our score at the end of year, 2, 3, 4, whatever. It's also something that we're seeing is of value from a insurance coverage perspective. So those organizations that have gone through this process oftentimes see reduced premiums because the carriers view them as a better risk, which probably makes a lot of sense. You can see the deliverables that come out of it. There's a health check report card, which again is intended to be shared with senior leadership or potentially an insurance carrier if they're interested, and then specific and prioritized remediation recommendations. So maybe there's a policy that needs to be updated because there's some new application your organization is using, or maybe the network changed. It really kind of varies depending on each client situation. Vulnerability scanning, not wanting to get too technical, but basically it's looking across your both internal and external infrastructure. So when I say external, think your website, or if you have multiple websites, or client or student portals, those types of things. So it's really looking for vulnerabilities. There's software patches that come out on a weekly basis, and hackers know that, and so they are looking to exploit those, and so you really want to stay on top of those. The value is that it identifies, it's specific to your infrastructure. It identifies potential exploits that could be then used by some bad actor. Again, like I mentioned several times, prioritization is really key. So the deliverable out of that is a prioritized vulnerability breakdown, and it's broken down by severity level and host. So maybe you have a device that has a very sort of non-sensitive data related role, and it's running a really old version of an operating system, but it maybe shows up as having a lot of critical vulnerabilities, which is the highest. You may say that's great, but I don't really care because there's nothing on there that is particularly sensitive, and where it is in the network, I'm not too worried about that. So prioritization and context is super important, and that would be provided as part of that. From a training, from the the people side, so those first few were more focused on the technical side. regular security awareness webinars. So they would cover, relevant topics such as threat trends, ransomware, business email compromise. Those are some of the biggies. Phishing, just phishing in general, spear phishing. Relevant topics, keeping up with. Maybe there's some new applications that are coming out that people are concerned about or should be concerned about. And it's an opportunity to really educate your organization on the latest threats and best practices. The deliverables, recorded webinar similar to this one, as well as the actual presentation itself. E-newsletters, again, everybody learns differently, and it's also kind of what I call the drip method, sort of from an awareness raising perspective. So these are all sequenced, so it's not like in 1 month or a couple times a year the users are hit with all these things. It's really every, there's a rhythm to it. Again, there's a cadence. It's another source of information. It's generally because these things are rapidly changing, a different set of focus on different trends and best practices. It's provided in, Adobe PDF format, which is easily shared and can be distributed to whomever is appropriate. Mock phishing exercises, we touched on these a little bit earlier. So these not only test the employee awareness and really kind of drive it home and make it personal, but they also test the technology. So we have a lot of clients that have moved from an in-house hosted Exchange platform or some other mail platform. They've moved to, Google email or Office 365, and they're always amazed by how, we didn't get a lot of, phishing emails or spam before, and then when we flip the switch, all of a sudden we're now getting a lot more than we ever have before. What's going on? Well, what most organizations don't realize is most of those platforms out of the box are not configured to, you basically have to dial them in, if you will, from a filtering perspective, and that's always a surprise to organizations. And that's not going to be done by Microsoft or Google. They're not going to do it for you, at least not that we've seen. They're really expecting you to do that for what makes sense for your organization. So some deliverables, there may be an email defense mechanism report, meaning that there's things that we recommend you would change from a settings perspective to really dial in your organization's filtering, as well as the actual results from the report or from the exercise. So, who did what they weren't supposed to, and again, it's not meant to be punitive. It's really meant to be a learning opportunity. Cybersecurity threats. So these are really ad hoc threat alerts, as they're appropriate for an organization and industry. So, if you're an Apple shop and you don't have any, Microsoft devices in your organization, or the opposite is true, you don't really care. Let's say you are an Apple shop, you don't really care if there's some big Microsoft operating system vulnerability or attack that just came out. Maybe you want to let your staff know for their home computers, but probably not. So you really only want to focus on those threats that are really unique to your environment. And so those are ad hoc because, again, we don't know, you sort of don't know about them until they're sort of in the midst of it, but that's something that's provided to, as part of this package. So a couple more slides. So this is, critical asset monitoring is really remote monitoring, remote security monitoring of critical assets. So think of things like firewall servers for really any security threat-related activities. The value of this is, again, like I mentioned, the sooner that you can see something bad is happening, the quicker you can react, and the more that you can contain what is happening. It also is valuable from a log management perspective. So every device creates a tremendous amount of log files that really capture everything that happens on that individual device. In the event that you were to have a data breach, those log files are critically important to a forensic firm if they were to come in. Ideally, they want to see 12 months of data. 12 months of log files is their preference. 6 months is kind of the minimum, the bare minimum. If you don't have any of that, then what that's going to mean is it's going to be significantly more expensive, either for the forensics company to do that analysis, or it may be that they just they're not able to do anything at all, or they're able to do very little. And so you really want to make sure that you have those records, and so that those types of things are captured within this component. Last slide on this one, I think. So just sort of we get calls all the time from clients as well as prospective folks, clients or people that we've networked with, and they always have, hey, I'm looking at this third-party cloud service provider. Can you take a look at the agreement and tell me what you think? Or my outsourced IT vendor says that they're doing security for me. They're maintaining our antivirus or whatever, and I'm not. Could you sort of take a look as kind of a sanity check? And so what we've included as part of this, because that's a pretty regular set of, most clients are on a regular basis needing access to some type of cybersecurity subject matter expertise. And so rather than, it really gives your IT and risk management staff a set of subject matter expertise that they can lean on as much or as little as needed. And really the deliverables are kind of case by case. So in some cases it could be a written report, in others it could just be, hey, get on a phone call with us and talk to a vendor that we're considering using. It could be, hey, we're implementing a new application. Can you, help us with the configuration? It really kind of varies pretty wildly, and so the deliverables also vary quite a bit. So this is just an example, again, just kind of laying out in a sort of schedule format, all across 4 quarters, kind of getting in that annual cadence of a way that you could, clients are sort of layering or sequencing each of the 8 different components that we covered. The CS just stands for client specific, and then webinars are typically shared, industry specific, but shared from a kind of an economies of scale perspective. So just some key takeaways, final slide. So again, strongly encourage you to think of cybersecurity from a risk management perspective. And if you do have a risk management process, which most independent schools that we've worked with do, ideally you're incorporating cybersecurity into that process. And so rather than trying to come up with sort of a separate parallel process. You really want to assume, schools are in the top 5 of the academic world, K through 12 as well as higher ed are always show up. There's lots of reports on data breaches. They always show up in the top 5. So you really want to assume that you will at some point experience, at least one data breach, probably multiple. So again, the key is trying to decrease the likelihood of that, and in the event that it does happen, really minimizing the impact to the organization. Your security program it must address all 3 pillars. So if you focus in on just the technology side, in our opinion, that's a mistake. In my opinion, you really want to look across all 3 areas and develop what we consider kind of a multifaceted approach, and that's the most effective. So it's no one thing that you're going to do that is going to prevent or minimize. It's really a combination, a collection of things. I think that's. Yep. So here's my contact information. You probably have Matt's as well, but after you have a chance to kind of digest all of this, if you have any questions, comments, things that I said that weren't clear, that you'd like a follow-on conversation, here's my contact information. Please feel free. We deliver a lot of security-related kind of content guides through social media, LinkedIn in particular. So if you are interested, would love for you to connect with me. Actually, here you can see, here are the different social media platforms where we distribute. So there's no sales content. It's all, really, informational content, if you will.
Awesome. So we do have 2 questions real quick. This one came up a lot. So what are the costs associated with cybersecurity as a service?
So the 2 kind of key cost components, at least that come up to or go into developing kind of the pricing, are the number of employees and the number of devices. And so the number of employees really influence those portions of cyber as a service that are sort of non-technical. So they're more focused on the people side and even the policy side to some extent. And then things like training, mock phishing exercises, newsletters, those types of things. And then the number of devices. So what I mean by devices, think of anything that has an IP address. So it could be firewalls, routers, switches, servers, laptops, desktops, tablets, Apple TVs, kind of any of that stuff would, assuming that it's networked, would have an IP address. And that's really more on the technical side when it comes to the vulnerability scanning and critical asset monitoring.
Cool. And last but not least, can organizations pick and choose which services that you mentioned here to kind of create a plan of their own?
Yeah, so it's really meant to be modular in the sense that, most clients choose to, probably the two that clients don't, or sort of view as more optional, I'll call it, is the critical asset monitoring, because sometimes maybe their IT vendor is doing that for them. And then the other one is the sort of kind of ongoing security consulting access. And typically what we find is those that don't necessarily start with that, because of the pervasiveness of technology, they ultimately at some point add it on. The other components are kind of the base, the base offering, but there is some flexibility there.
Great. Well, those are all the questions we have. Again, if anyone has anything that they didn't want to ask during this session, feel free to either email me, or I'll go to this last slide again with Bob's contact information if you wanted to reach out for a further discussion. So like I said, we're going to be sending this recorded webinar out later this week, so look out for that email and feel free to share that with any of your colleagues if you think they'd be interested in joining a discussion later on. Thank you guys and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.